So we just wanted to get a sense of your perspective on the panel questions as well, and now we will move into the interactive question and answer from the audience. The first question asks for a little more detail, Dan, about the ASSIST training that you've developed in Iowa. Can you tell us a little more about that program?
Yes, this was brought in as we started to work with our staff, our treatment staff, our case workers on motivational interviewing. We did more and more of that. We wanted to get a kind of a more simplified training process or one that could impact a larger audience of our correctional officers and our residential officers that were out in our community corrections agencies. We wanted something for them to get an understanding of what that meant. And so we worked with Ken Serber on the ASSIST model, and Ken came in and provided us with training on this ASSIST curriculum that really reached out and did a smaller snapshot view of the motivational interviewing training that we had a large majority of our staff go through.
Thank you, Dan, for that detail. The audience is also curious about family-child relationship building programs in jails that have improved reentry outcomes. Gary, we'll start with your experience in Dutchess County. Can you tell us a little bit about family-building programs or any other evidence-based reentry programs around family reunification that occur in the jails?
There are family treatments that are available, but aside from that, we had great success in establishing a transition plan with each and every inmate and then identifying pro-social family members as well as pro-criminal family members. As we know, inmates transitioning back to the community often face one of the biggest obstacles in that their family is criminal. So we would establish both those groups of people and invite the pro-social people in to be working partners in the transition plan themselves and think about how the inmate was going to transition and stay among pro-social family members. And once we got that established, we would actually invite some pro-criminal members in if they seemed to be interested, at least, in the inmate's success, and start to try and work with them a little bit and talk with them both about their own criminality and their effect on the transitioning inmates.
Thank you, Gary. Cindy, would you like to interject some experience around family reunification?
Well, I think first of all, the research that I've seen about this has not been extensive. The only one that comes to my mind is that I read somewhere that the visitation in terms of the parent and the child needs to be a meaningful interaction in order to be effective. And so I think this idea of mixing the groups in with pro-social people is a very good one because it makes it more meaningful. So it doesn't go, what I learned from that is it doesn't go far enough to just, here's the child and here's the parent and they're going to have a visit. But, you know, there needs to be some assurance that that visit is going to be positive and it's going to be proactive, it's going to be meaningful for, you know, for both. As I said previously, it's a big challenge when people return and, you know, have to face this absent parenting, reestablishing relationships, you know, particularly with teenagers who, you know, may be already engaging in problematic behavior themselves, and so it's sort of hard to say, you know, don't do what I have done, you know, even though I'm newly released. So it does present a lot of challenges, and I think there's probably going to be more research needed in terms of this area and what is going to be effective in terms of outcomes.
Thank you, Cindy. Along the same line of additional research being necessary, we have a few questions from different audience members asking about if there are evidence-based practices for the transition of mentally ill clients, and are other disability barriers being addressed adequately in jails and prisons and reentry programs. We'd like to start with you, Dan.
Oh, okay. Yes, certainly we've been able to develop some mental health transition programs that are focused on a interdisciplinary team made up both in the communities and then involvement with our prison system. And it's really these local teams, including members of the community and judges, similar to that of a drug court or mental health court, but it's working with a probation officer working right out of the jails, working with those jail offenders is one element, and they're working to try to transition them back into the community and get them out of the jails. But it's also another element is the working directly with the prison system, knowing that we're going to have these offenders coming out into our communities, working with each of the institutions, reaching in to help them with that. Part of that is hooking up, trying to get them hooked up with resources before they come out, and that communication and that reentry planning needs to begin, long before that happens. One of the things we struggle with out there is getting those community funding sources set up, and so in Iowa we have what are CPCs, which is Central Points of Coordination individuals in each of our counties. We got 99 counties in Iowa. So we've got these CPCs that are reentry coordinators, and these transitional folks specifically for the mentally ill do a lot of intensive work with. And that's where our focus is at, just reaching in, finding out what's coming out, and then working locally in our different areas with those different resource providers.
Thank you, Dan. We'd like to also ask Gary, in your experience at Dutchess, did you find that there were promising reentry programs around disability barriers such as mental health?
Well, around the issue of mental health, both in Dutchess, what we had to learn, and what I've found all over the country is that when we get involved with programs for mentally ill inmates, as we assume that the main criminogenic risk and need is mental illness, and that may or may not be the case, but one of the biggest mistakes that we make is to forget to assess for criminality as well, and to assess for criminogenic risk and needs. Frankly, the risks and needs, and there's plenty of research demonstrating that the risks and needs among mentally ill populations distribute the same as it does in regular criminal populations. So that's not to say that mental illness isn't a primary issue and a primary need, but it's a major mistake to not integrate with mental health providers and establish the need to make available good evidence-based programming and practice for high-risk offenders as well. So if you do that, I mean, once they get grouped out, these folks need to be grouped just like offenders who are not afflicted with mental illness, and address them accordingly.
Thank you, Gary. We've also had some technical issues with Max Williams from the Department of Correction in Oregon, but he did want to interject that they've had some promising experiences with parenting courses related to the last question around family and child relationship building, and they've been studying that program and they've had promising results. So we will be sure to also feed that information to the audience members through the follow-up question and answer document that we will provide on our website. Gary, I'm sorry, Dan, I see that you're back now. Do you want to just verify that for me?
Yes, I am. Okay,
great. We also got a few questions around the latest data regarding viability and sustainability of jail reentry programs, and you talked to us a little bit about sustainability. Do you want to start with that question, and then we'll pass that to Cindy?
The sustainability of reentry programs?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Part of the efforts, I think, is to look at again, at leadership at the top, and starting with a large collaborative group of folks and leaders through both within your correction system and within other agencies throughout the state. You know, we're partnering. We've developed a statewide statewide reentry leadership team that's made up of wardens, district directors, the director, and executive staff and deputy directors, as well as members of the Board of Parole and partner agencies like workforce development and so on. And I think that's where it begins to make it happen. It needs to start with leadership at the top and fulfilling the vision that you have for reentry throughout the organization. And none of this, I guess the feeling would really be is that none of it could be sustained if we do it alone. We've tried it. You can't do it alone. You need your partners around you. So you develop it at a broad statewide level, and then at local levels you develop those reentry collaboration as well. And so when your partner on a local level from IWI is talking back and forth with you, and that's Iowa Workforce Development, excuse me, or another partner in Department of Human Services, or wherever it might be, they know that their boss, their leadership is supporting this from the top as well.
Thank you, Dan. And now I'd also like to get from Cindy the local perspective. Cindy?
In terms of viability, I was at the recent National Drug Court Conference, and there's some real promising research coming out about reentry programs. I think that the jury has been out for quite a while in terms of outcomes, but Dr. Douglas Marlowe gave some interesting meta-analysis research regarding that, and they're getting a little closer to some definitive research. In terms of sustainability, I've been very encouraged by the Second Chance Act grants that are out there, and the renewed focus on funding availability, which definitely will give reentry programs across the country some more stability in terms of funding sources. I've found that grant process to be helpful because it does sort of give you a structure and provide information about collaboration and board groups and so forth. And so I'm very encouraged by both the research and the opportunity for sustainability of reentry programs.
Thank you, Cindy. Based on both of your answers, it sounds like the speech and presentation that Dan gave us around both building a broad leadership group as well as making sure that those skills are taught to each level of staff really also feeds into the sustainability issue. Our next question is around involving citizens. Folks in the audience are saying that while it's extremely important for us to be talking about evidence-based practice, that it is also important to be educating the general public about evidence-based practices and corrections and what that means. Our audience member would like to know, how do we go about educating the general public to make criminal justice a more important issue to legislators? We'd like to start with you, Gary.
Well, first off, I think now more than ever, criminal justice is an important issue. It's always in the news, and usually in the news because it costs too much money, and the outcome and recognition that the outcomes are poor, but mainly that it costs too much money. So it's our responsibility as corrections professionals to get out there in the community and employ members of the community as parts of the system, and understand that they have an important role in good jail or prison transition policy as well, simply as citizens, and things that they can do as business owners and just citizens of our local communities to facilitate successful transition, provide services, provide support, and push the right initiatives throughout legislative agendas, and et cetera, et cetera. But, I mean, community is an extremely important part And I don't think we have to go too far to make criminal justice part of the news. It's just because it's already there. What we need to do as professionals is recognize our responsibility to get out there and take every opportunity we can to educate people, including going to local media, going to editorial boards. We've had great success doing that. They're very interested to hear about initiatives that work and very interested to recognize their part, that is the media, recognize their part in being a community partner for jail reentry or prison reentry initiatives.
Thank you, Gary. We've also gotten a note from Max, who is listening intently to the panel discussion and wishing that he could provide his input, but we will do that for him. He says, I think the current budget cycle requires that we demonstrate to legislators and editorial boards that good EBP can actually reduce the cost of corrections. It is the cost-benefit relationship that will allow us to actually get to the point where we can do the right policy. Dan, we'd also like to hear from you about the Iowa experience in terms of educating the general public around what you've been doing with reentry practices.
Well, yes, and I think they're right on target. You can use that information, use the results that you have, and get the resources that you need through your case. We have been successful in doing that. So I would agree. You know, you're going to take opportunities to present the positive things that you're doing relative to improvements in your organization. You're going to use that media. You're going to take the opportunity with all legislators that you can and reflect the positive things that are going on. One of the other things that we've done, we developed a friends and family guidebook, and it's more than just the family, but it's the average citizen, and we posted that on our corrections website, and it's really a guide to give folks an understanding of that we adhere to best practices in corrections, and that we want the family and the social supports out there, and that they're very important to us, leading us to success. So there's lots of different ways, but it's important that we engage the community in every way we can in all the positive attributes. The negative things that are going to go on, those are going to happen to us. So it's an effort, a concentrated effort to consistently focus on the positive. And the other thing, I guess, is that you want to look at, and in that communication, we need to make sure that the public knows that offenders are returning to the communities. 95% or so are coming back to them. And we want to make them better and more successful and positive reflections in the community. So that's our job, and that's what we need to help the public to understand.
Thank you, Dan.
If I could jump in there also, I mean, I've used that statistic as I go around, and that tends to be a very powerful statistic. Most folks don't know that 95% of the people are coming back to them, and frankly, close to 95% who are in local county facilities are transitioning directly to the streets, and they're usually doing it for an average length of stay of about 30 days. So the public thinks that when people are being locked up, that they're being locked up, that we're actually locking them up and throwing the proverbial key away, and that's just not the case. So, when they start to understand how quickly the turnaround is for jail inmates anyway, they recognize the importance of them getting involved and doing things that actually change behavior as part of a system intervention.
So true, Gary, and it feeds right into our next question. We had a follow-up to that question, which asked about how do you message around evidence-based practices not being soft on crime, and I believe that the conversation that you and Dan just had about using the statistics and identifying to them, that folks are coming back to the communities and that the majority of them will in fact return, and it behooves us to implement the evidence-based practices. Max also wanted to interject that in Oregon, they have strong local community reentry efforts. And so in Oregon, they have a county-by-county system where each county builds strong relationships with their community, and the outreach goes beyond just the usual suspects. So they include employers, landlords, other service providers, nonprofits, faith-based community, to get as much as they can out of the public and educate as many people as they can. The next question that we'd like to address talks about how to foster an attitude of respect, both self-respect and mutual, between inmates and staff. Cindy, we'd like to start with you.
Well, definitely this, what I talked about earlier about modeling is so important because, again, we learn what we live and what we observe. And so if we are modeling a disrespectful way of interacting with others, then it's going to be, coming back our way in terms of, resulting in a disrespectful attitude towards staff. The other thing I think is important is for staff to learn effective listening skills. Part of EBP is typically includes something to enhance motivation, which typically is motivational interviewing, and through learning those discussion and communication skills, we learn to what we in the field call rolling with resistance, looking beyond a resistant defensive standpoint in order to respond to what's actually happening behind the scenes, the thought process, and so forth. So I think those two things are really important and would go a long way towards a mutually satisfactory interaction between staff and inmates.
Thank you, Cindy. In follow-up to that question, we've received several questions around staff training that was touched on in both Dan's presentation and in Gary's comments. And folks are asking, how do you address non-compliance issues with staff, and what are the specific practices in terms of quality control and fidelity measures that have been implemented in order to ensure that skills taught in training are in fact being used, which feeds right into that culture of mutual respect. And before we toss that question to another panelist, we wanted to let folks know that in Oregon, Max is letting us know that they have a system called the OAM, which is the Oregon Accountability Model. And one major element of that is pro-social interaction between staff and offenders. It is, in fact, a job expectation for the staff, and it is a culture issue that they work on and have worked on for the past decade. So it is an evolutionary and ongoing process. Dan, we'd like to hear from you about what specific practices, again, in terms of quality control and fidelity measures, you've used to ensure that skills taught in training are in fact being used by the staff.
Well, and one of the things, I guess, is that you can't shove this down staff's throat. This is something you've got to sell them on them. You've got to sell it on the results and sell the things that do work and how we can make their jobs more efficient. We built this in, and as I talked about, we built it into the warden's performance plans. Those performance plans we're still, working down to the line level, but it's certainly down through the leadership levels through in each of our institutions and districts, and we're using that to hold staff accountable for ensuring that they understand what role they play in the success of our population, the successful reentry of our population. And so there's a variety of things that we do relative to those performance plans. We also do a lot of training is a big key to that, helping them understand how these different programs work and what we can do to be more successful. And we do the continued assessment, and with that continued assessment, we then provide the feedback on what's working and what's not working and why we're going to continue. So it's a variety of things that we do to hold staff accountable and responsible and encourage their participation in the process. It's their role in reentry of the offenders, and it's just built right into their performance plans.
Thank you, Dan. Cindy, do you have anything to add about specific practices that are being used to measure skills taught in training and used by staff?
We have an orientation program for new staff, and there's an expectation that all new staff that are hired will pass an audio video. Was delivered to us on a CD, and then our clinical supervisor reviews that against a score sheet for, again, motivational interviewing skills. And then all staff are expected to pass skills at an acceptable level within 1 year of hire. Current staff then are expected to have refreshers and attend refreshers and to, again, pass those every other year, which we're currently in a year now where they're turning those in. Dan mentioned staff input, which is critical throughout the EBP implementation process. We had focus groups comprised of staff that looked at each area, and because, as he said, if they're not with you, it's not going to happen. At least when nobody's looking, it's not going to happen. And so we then extended that past implementation, and we have a staff-driven quality management committee where they are currently in the process of looking at those critical indicators that can be measurable in order to assure, fidelity at all different levels. So that's where we are in the process now, is looking at fidelity. It's important because you can say you're doing this stuff, but if you're really not, the concern being that we might be setting ourselves up for failure because we're talking about increased outcomes and better results, and yet if we're not using these principles with fidelity, that won't happen, and it would begin to erode the whole expectation about evidence-based practice. So those indicators and processes are extremely important.
Thank you, Cindy. Max also wanted to let us know that in Oregon they see this as a leadership issue, and it's driven and modeled top-down, that they actually look at both staff behaviors and performance evaluations as well as inmate grievances and several other measures, and they attempt to promote those who accept this approach. So they're looking at it from a performance issue as opposed to non-compliance, and trying to reinforce the positive behaviors that they're looking for folks to model. They also do a fidelity assessment, a CPC, which is a shorter version of the CPAI, on all of their evidence-based programs to ensure that they're getting what they think they're getting. And that allows them to have programs that are it allows them to address when programs are faltering so that they can bring them back to a higher level of performance. Those assessments happen on a regular basis and are continually monitored and evaluated, Cindy, as you said as well. Through their research unit, they also survey their staff to determine whether the training they've been attending is actually sticking. So they are constantly providing boosters as well as follow-up to ensure that those new skills and behaviors are ingrained in their daily approach to safety and security. We'd also like to step back to the research. We're having some questions come from the audience around what the research suggests as effective for incarcerated members of security threat groups, namely gangs. And Dan, we'd like to start with you with this question.
You're going to have to repeat that for me.
Sure. We have an audience member wondering what the research suggests as effective for incarcerated gang members. So are there specific reentry approaches that you use in Iowa to address the issue of security threat groups such as gangs in the DOC?
We have monitoring groups throughout our institutions and districts. It's really the work, the cognitive work with each of the individuals that makes the change, and so it's trying to separate them from their from the gang or that they're involved with, and keep them and get them out of that process and focusing on the things that they want to improve in their life, and focusing on family and those things that might be important to them. So our effort is individual, and it's just a focus on how do we make changes for you in your reentry programming from the day you walk in, and try to do that on an individual basis.
Thank you, Dan. Gary, we'd like to hear from you. Were there specific reentry practices with gang-related members that you found worked or were promising in Dutchess County or in your consulting work?
Well, of course, everything that Dan just said applies perfectly. The one thing that we would add, that I would add to that, is that when we involve an inmate in transitional services or transition services, whether it be cognitive behavioral programming or whatever it might be, we ask that they do not engage in any gang activities, or that they disengage from the gang, at least while it's safe to do so while they're in the correctional facility. And we require them to sign a document that they do that. And we work with them on what it means to disengage with this group of people while they're going through their cognitive restructuring and trying to figure out what it would be like to be without a gang within the community.
Thank you, Gary. That's very interesting. And Cindy, do you want to share with us experiences in Grant County working specifically with gang-related members?
I don't think I have anything to add that would be different than what's already been stated.
Okay, thank you. The next audience question asks about if there are evidence-based guidelines for group therapy in prison settings. They're wondering if types of groups that affect recidivism the most. So we've heard from Gary that we need to be sure to address the top criminogenic needs for each offender, but is there in fact guidelines used in each of your jurisdictions for group therapy programming in institutional settings? Cindy, we'd like to start with you.
The research definitely shows that the best approach for offenders, regardless of their whether they're in the community or in the facility, is cognitive behavioral therapies. And there's been a lot of research on, for instance, Thinking for a Change, which is a curriculum that that's available through the NIC website. There's a cognitive self-change, which is developed by Jack Bush from Vermont. And there are a variety of others, and the research seems to be showing that as long as the group is connecting the thought processes to the behavior, that they're making connection, that thinking drives behavior, there's perhaps not a lot of difference in terms of one specific program over another, as long as it's a cognitive behavioral program.
And I would just add, this is Dan, as we've done assessments in our institutions or districts when we've gone out and reviewed programs that are going on out there and visited with the offenders within the system, the feedback that I consistently got was that really helped them was that role modeling and doing the role playing, on how to improve in that area, and that cognitive behavior programs that work have good role-playing components to them.
Thank you.
If I could add to that also, Dan's Freudian slip about role modeling really is important. As we've said before, I take every chance I can when I meet an offender who has escaped the cycle. And invariably, they always say that it was a person that influenced them. While they're in cognitive behavioral training, they watch people, and they watch people who do this in their day-by-day life. And invariably, they always say, person such and such, or it was a CO on my floor, or whoever it was, but oftentimes it's the person you would least suspect that they watch to apply the skills that they learn while they're learning different methods to communicate, different methods to get involved and deal with conflict and things like that. So, I mean, that's just essential.
Such a great point, Gary, and it also is is in line with what Max is telling us here. He's saying that they, in Oregon, don't mix low-risk offenders with high-risk offenders, which is also something that the research supports and falls in line with what you're saying, that the role modeling can be both positive and negative, in fact. And so by not mixing low-risk and high-risk offenders, Oregon DOC is able to use the assessment scores to determine who gets what invention and intervention and at what time, so that they don't mix those two groups and actually negatively impact those low-risk offenders. We have a question coming in now that's asking whether there's a link available for the audience to use to be able to mimic the clinical best practices for their staff training. I'll throw that out to each of the panelists and see if anyone wants to provide additional information for either forms or tools that other jurisdictions would be able to use as a guideline to develop their own.
Well, I can talk quickly about the link that's available out there right now for the transition to jail, from jail to the community toolkit. It's been recently, I was a co-author, it's recently put out by the Urban Institute and the NIC, and it's got there's a pretty comprehensive set of information about reentry and transition as a whole. But there are parts in there about group facilitation and clinical skills that correction staff can utilize, and pretty much everything that we discussed today there is some reference or some mention of everything we've discussed today within that toolkit. And I've mentioned the link, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but I certainly can get it.
And we'd be happy to provide that in the frequently asked questions document that we'll post up on our website following the broadcast. So thank you, Gary, for that.
And this is Dan. Yeah, a lot of the things are on our website already. There are specific forms and pieces that are not that we've shared to put on CJI's website, or you can contact certainly me directly at my email address.
That's wonderful, Dan, and we will be sure to post those as well for folks to be able to access. The last question that we have, well, two more questions. Second to last question is a follow-up again to the staff training questions, and we have a question coming in that asks, can utilizing staff through a train-the-trainers model be considered as effective as having certified clinicians provide cognitive therapy? Cindy, we'd like to throw this question to you.
I probably need to hear that repeated because I heard it about train-the-trainers, and then could you repeat that?
Sure. The audience member is asking whether a model utilizing train-the-trainers approach to training for staff is as effective as having certified clinicians provide cognitive therapy. So if you train folks in-house and use staff to deliver the cognitive therapy, is it as effective as having certified clinicians do the same?
Okay, now I'm with you. Well, we do have trained trainers. That's the approach that we use here. There's some advantages to doing that. Cost being one. If you have the staff resources to devote to programming, then you're going to have a savings in terms of contracting for that and that sort of thing. Again, we use trained trainers. We have Thinking for a Change trainers and facilitators, and that works well for us. I don't know if any of the other panelists, have had a different experience, but I certainly would recommend that if that's possible and you have the staff resources.
Well, I think, I guess our perspective is that you need to build the capacity from within because resources are not there. And any corrections agency across the country that has the resources to spend on outside clinicians to come in and provide it, that's wonderful. I wish we were with you. But the reality is that we haven't, and it's difficult. So we want to build that capacity within and build those experts within to provide that ongoing training and that continual follow-up. I mean, you can provide, a single program and must have continued positive reinforcement that takes and that takes staff skills. So you've got to continue to reinforce and continue to reinforce. And if you don't have anybody trained locally, you're not going to have that continued reinforcement.
And if I could jump in there, I agree with that completely. And frankly, there's research to show that at least as good are community corrections or jail or prison corrections officials in implementing and facilitating, whether it be T for C or reasoning and rehabilitation or moral recognition therapy or whatever it is, that practitioners are every bit as good at delivering that service. The added benefit that Dan alluded to is that not only do they deliver the service, but then they go back where the offenders live. And the offenders have to be aware of correction officers who know the curriculum and actually train the curriculum that they had went through for an hour that particular day. When they're back on the unit at night, engaged in what we like to call stinking thinking, that the correction officer can actually check them on that while they're in their living environment. Whereas if it's a trained therapist, the trained therapist delivers the therapy, goes home, and the inmate goes back to his or her living environment within the correctional facility. I mean, to me, there's plenty of use for trained clinicians to deal with mental illness and things that corrections or community corrections folks can't be trained for. So there's plenty to go around, and frankly, it's a lot more efficient, as both the previous panelists have said, to use corrections staff for things that they can do at least every bit as efficiently as trained clinicians.
Thank you, Gary, for that. And it sounds like all the panelists are in agreement that all of us can be change agents for the offenders in the community, and that we each do impact them in different ways at different times. It also feeds back to the premise that collaboration is critical. Our final question, we will ask for a brief response from each of the three panelists, and then we will move to final thoughts from Mr. Dan Craig. What would your advice be to a jurisdiction or agency just starting down the road of implementing evidence-based policies and practices? Cindy, we'll start with you.
Well, you know, definitely, I think what Dan shared in terms of their experiences is right in line with our experience. You have a basic learning curve, and you know, what are the principles, what do they mean, training your top leadership and your mid-management, being sure that they are 100% on board and are able to, both from a buy-in perspective and a modeling perspective, you know, to start putting forth those principles. And then, you know, from there, looking at perhaps an evaluation or some method to arrive at sort of where are we now and where do we want to be, and putting into place a plan, you know, for how you're going to get there.
Thank you, Cindy. Gary, any final thoughts?
Well, at a top level, to me, where I've had success is going in and getting agreement on the major overarching premises why they do business, and usually long-term public safety works wonders, whether they come from the left or the right, or they're extremely conservative or extremely liberal, or for rehabilitation or punishment. Nobody can really disagree with that the system wants to enhance long-term public safety. So once you gain that agreement among key leadership stakeholders, the work then becomes how do we best attain long-term public safety, and that leads you right into reviewing all your practices in the context of the extensive literature on evidence-based practice, and then taking it one step down to an organizational level and thinking about how your mission complies with that overarching system mission.
Thank you, Gary. And we have a final thought from Max, and then I'll turn it over to Dan for his final thoughts. Max wants to let everyone know that while this budget environment is challenging, it does in fact present opportunities to both choose among those things that really matter and to make the case for EBP and transition resources over the long term to lower the cost of public safety while in fact still keeping people safe. Some of our budget problems will counter the soft-on-crime defense to these programs and efforts. Max, we'd like to especially thank you for hanging in there with us even though you weren't able to provide your thoughts directly to the audience. And with that, I will turn this over to Dan for his final thoughts and wrap up.